Up till now, I haven't put a name to what I've been teaching you. And it's not because I'm hiding anything, it's because it doesn't really need a name, and it doesn't matter what name you give it. And it has all kinds of names given to it by all different kinds of people. But I avoid labeling things because jargon is the enemy of truth. I'll say that again. Jargon is the enemy of truth. If you're in some kind of in-house environment where you're all talking to each other in this group vocabulary that you've all agreed on, you have ceased to think about the concepts that those words represent. And that's always a hazard for spiritual seekers, because you start getting into your head that you've arrived. And there's no such thing as arriving. There is only evolution. There is only unfoldment, presumably forever. But before we put a name on it, before we pick our name for it, I want to tell you where it comes from, because it's really a great story. This teaching started in Portland, Maine, in the US, with a clockmaker and inventor named Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. I know. Quimby still has some patents on file at the US Patent Office, like he invented a new kind of wagon hitch and things like that. And Quimby, in 1839, was diagnosed with what he would have called the consumption, which you and I call tuberculosis. Now, nowadays, tuberculosis is eminently curable. A friend of mine took a trip overseas and came back with tuberculosis. They gave him some pills and he was fine. Back in those days, you died. It was completely incurable and utterly irreversible. And what happened was your lungs would slowly fill up with your own bodily fluids until you would finally suffocate. And Quimby was offended by the idea that a beautiful instrument like the human body could be taken down by a microorganism. And so he theorized, remember he was a clockmaker, he theorized that since his lungs were filling up with fluid, a daily regimen of deep breathing would keep his lungs clear and he'd go on living. And so he put together this whole deep breathing program for himself with calisthenics and things. He did them out on his front porch and got a reputation with his neighbors. And one of the things he did to get his heart rate going, what we would call his cardio, was to ride his horse at a gallop up and down the hills around his city. And one day he was out riding like that, and he felt the disease lift from him. He just suddenly knew it was gone. And well, hurrah, he'd invented the cure for tuberculosis. So he got together all these other poor tubercular people. And, well, spoiler alert, deep breathing does not cure tuberculosis. So after putting them through his paces, I'm sure they all went away profoundly disappointed. But this left Quimby with an interesting paradox to figure out, because if deep breathing didn't cure tuberculosis, then what did? Because if there's one thing he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, it was that he didn't have tuberculosis anymore. And there wasn't all that deep breathing that cured him. What the heck did? And he formed a new theory that maybe there is a function in the human brain that will heal the body in spectacular ways if it's properly activated. And he experimented with that idea for a couple of years. He got very interested in hypnotism, which was a newfangled thing back then. They didn't even call it hypnotism. They called it mesmerism and animal magnetism and stuff like that. And he finally came to the conclusion that the human brain has no such function. And he realized that he was healed by something greater than himself, some sort of presence or power outside of himself that was also inside of himself. He couldn't really figure out what had happened. But his inquiries, his ongoing research into what has happened evolved, and he started pulling in students who wanted to learn from him, and he started working healings on people in his neighborhood, spiritual healings of physical disease, incurable diseases. And eventually he got a national reputation. He was quite famous in his day. They called him Doc Quimby even though he had no medical training at all, because of these spectacular healings he brought about in people by teaching them how to change the way they thought. And eventually all of this became what in the 19th century was called the New Thought movement. And it was the most popular spiritual movement of the 19th century. It was making the churches very nervous because they kind of thought it was taking over. And the stories of the healings that come out of that time are just amazing. It remained principally a teaching of the spiritual healing of physical disease, because in the 19th century, if something went really wrong with your body, you pretty much had to resort to spiritual healing. Medical science, if you want to call it that, really did not have much for you. All your town doctor had in his little black bag was a stethoscope and a bottle of whiskey. You know, if he was a specialist, he had a saw. So people threw themselves into these spiritual healings and produced extraordinary results. And as things evolved, the understanding came about that all conditions in a person's life begin in their thought and then take form around them. And that by changing the way you think, you can change what takes form around you, which is how we practice things today. And in the 1920s, with the discovery of penicillin, medical science started taking over healing from New Thought and other kinds of spiritual healing, which is good. That's the way it should be. Medical science is the healing power of God emerging into form. But that emergence is not complete yet. Medical science can't fix everything, and when you get something that can't be fixed, you end up coming to somebody like me, usually as a crazy, last-ditch, desperate act. Now, late in the 19th century, people started injecting other religions into the New Thought teaching, which is unfortunate. And you may decide you want to be part of a group that, teaches and practices the things I'm teaching in these videos, and that's a very good thing to do. It's good to have people you can bounce ideas back and forth with who are on the same path you are. It's enormously useful. But you will have to shop around, because the teaching you get will depend on the consciousness of the individual who is the leader of the particular group. And of course, quality varies. You will also run into people who will tell you that this teaching has its roots in Christianity. And those are the exact words they will use, has its roots in Christianity. That is utter bullshit. I just told you where its roots go, and they don't go back any farther than 1839. I don't know why people think they need to attach this teaching to some ancient something or other, because it stands on its own quite well without being beholden to anybody's pre-existing religious anything. Maybe their consciousness hasn't developed to the point where they can let go of their old religion. Or maybe they think the teaching lacks credibility if you can't attach it to some ancient something or other. Maybe they think that they as individuals lack credibility if they can't present themselves as a representative of some ancient something or other. I really don't understand what's going on there, but it's a shame because it's unnecessary. This teaching speaks for itself. It doesn't need to be included in any other pre-existing something or other. Now, okay, the things I'm teaching you, have they shown up before in human history? Well, of course they have. We're talking about the spiritual reality of the universe. It'd be ridiculous to say nobody knew anything about it until 1839. 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, pray believing it is already yours and it will be given unto you. I'm going to be teaching you how to do that in the next series of videos. The Bhagavad Gita, great spiritual text of India. Lord Krishna says to the warrior Arjuna, speaking of the infinite, he says, I am that, thou art that, and all this is that, which is a lovely poetic way of saying everything is made of God. 3,000 years ago, a Greek philosopher whose name is Heraclitus, wow, I remembered that. He came up with the idea of an infinite primordial substance out of which all forms proceed. He called it the apiron, which means the endless. So yeah, these ideas have shown up here and there. And whenever I give a public appearance, seminar, lecture, whatever, I always have question and answer time afterwards, because it's fun. And somebody always gets up. Somebody always gets up and says, you know, Gregory, new thought really isn't new. Yeah, and I get what they mean, and it sounds kind of wise and insightful, but it's actually wrong. What I'm teaching you is new for two reasons. The first reason is we are using the scientific process to approach spiritual questions. The scientific process is when you form a hypothesis, something you think is probably true. You perform an experiment to test the truth of that hypothesis, and then you draw your conclusions entirely from the results of the experiment and not from anywhere else. Nobody's ever done that before. And the second reason is the applicational aspect of it. You know, we don't just learn this stuff so we can feel smug and good about ourselves. We learn this stuff so that we can apply our spiritual power to the conditions of our lives and change things for the better. Nobody's ever done that before. People have prayed to a separate God out there begging for something, but those prayers hardly ever come true because the person praying is begging for a positive outcome while believing in the negative outcome. And you're going to get what you believe. But anyway, we need a name. So I propose we just call it Truth. Truth with a capital T. You and I are truth students. We are truth seekers. Now, in the next series of videos, Series 2, I'm going to tell you how to put what I've taught you in this set of videos to work in your life and make things better. So, and maybe you think during these previous videos I've been kind of discursive and going all over the place. I really haven't. These lectures were very carefully planned and put together, and you will find when you start practicing your spirituality in a practical way that different ideas from different videos are going to start coming together in your head, this one with this one with this one, and you'll start to realize that what I have given you in this set of videos is an organically whole and complete spiritual system that explains everything. So, see you in Series 2.